All right, so let's dive into some serious food for thought today.
Okay.
Imagine everyone on Earth wakes up tomorrow
Okay.
with the same amount of money.
Wow.
Poof.
Yeah.
Gone are the billionaires vanished? Are the folks struggling to make rent?
Mm.
Just a level playing field for all 8 billion of us?
Yeah.
Crazy, right. But what would that even look like for you? What would change in your day-to-day life?
Well, it's a thought experiment that I think immediately reveals the deeply ingrained reality of inequality, wouldn't you say?
It really does. And it makes those stats about the richest 1% owning nearly half the world's wealth,
Yeah.
while the bottom 50% hold on to a measly 2%,
Right.
hit differently, doesn't it?
It does.
It's like this imbalance is baked into the very fabric of our world.
Yeah.
So today we're going deep.
Okay.
We'll trace the historical roots of this disparity, see how it plays out between countries,
Okay.
and then zoom in on how it fractures realities within nations.
Yeah.
And most importantly, we'll explore why this matters for all of us,
Right.
regardless of our own economic standing.
The source material you sent over is particularly intriguing because it doesn't shy away from the human cost of these economic forces.
Yeah.
We're not just dealing with abstract numbers.
Right.
We're talking about real lives, real consequences.
Yeah.
For example, did you know that in some countries, a child born into poverty is statistically less likely to reach their 5th birthday than a child born into wealth?
Wow, that's heavy stuff.
It is.
But it underscores why this deep dive is so important.
Absolutely.
So let's rewind the clock.
Okay.
For centuries, wealth wasn't about stock portfolios, right?
Oh.
It was about land, who controlled the resources, and what your community could access.
Yeah.
But then things started shifting with the agricultural revolution, and then went into overdrive with industrialization.
Yeah.
More productivity, sure,
Yeah.
but also new power dynamics.
Exactly. It's like a concentration of power happened.
Right?
You had a small group seizing control of resources and the means of production, while the majority ended up working within these increasingly rigid systems.
Yeah.
Industrial capitalism in the 19th century really turbocharged this process. And then layer on top of that colonialism,
Right.
where European powers systematically siphoned wealth from Asia, Africa, and the Americas,
Yeah.
leaving scars that still haven't healed.
It's like the world was redealt, and
Yeah.
some were dealt a royal flush,
Mm.
while others were left with a pair of deuces.
Right.
And even when many countries in the global south fought for and won their independence,
Yeah.
they often found themselves in a new kind of bind, right?
Right. Imagine finally breaking free from colonial rule,
Yeah,
only to find that your nation is largely reliant on exporting raw materials.
right.
This dependence on global market prices,
Yeah,
often set by the very powers that colonized you, can be incredibly limiting.
yeah.
It creates this vulnerability that echoes the patterns of the past. It's a theme that pops up again and again in the research.
It's almost like the game was rigged from the start, and those rigged rules have led to the massive discrepancies we see today.
Absolutely.
The average person in a high-income nation like the US or Germany has a GDP per capita that's about 25 times greater
Wow.
than someone in a low-income nation like Burundi or Malawi.
Yeah.
Those aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Right.
They represent drastically different life realities.
Think about this. A study by the World Health Organization found that a child born in Sierra Leone is over 50 times more likely to die before their 5th birthday than a child born in, say, Sweden.
Oh my gosh.
The gap in healthcare infrastructure, access to clean water, and basic nutrition,
Yeah.
it's all connected to this larger web of global inequality.
That puts things into stark perspective.
It does.
And it's crucial to understand that this isn't just a case of some countries being behind on some development timeline.
Right.
There are systemic issues at play here.
Yeah.
For example, many developing nations are caught in what's called a debt trap, where they're stuck in a cycle of borrowing and repayment that siphons off resources they desperately need for essential services.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Imagine a nation having to choose between repaying loans to wealthy nations and institutions or funding healthcare and education for its own people.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that in many cases,
Wow.
countries are actually spending more on debt repayment than on crucial social services.
It's like they're running on a financial treadmill that gets them nowhere.
Exactly.
And while many in the global north benefit from industrialization, it's often the global south that bears the brunt of its environmental downsides.
That's right.
It's pretty jarring to consider how rising sea levels, droughts, and deforestation often hit poorest nations the hardest, even though they contributed the least to the climate crisis.
This is what some call climate inequality, adding another layer of complexity to the equation.
Right.
It raises questions about responsibility, about who benefits and who suffers from the way our global systems are set up. It's a potent reminder that the effects of inequality extend far beyond just economics.
Right. And it really makes you question the whole system, doesn't it?
It does.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
The narrative of inequality isn't just about entire nations.
Yeah.
It's playing out
Yeah.
right within our own borders, too.
Absolutely.
Fracturing the realities of people living side by side.
Yeah.
You've got CEOs in the U.S.
Right.
raking in hundreds of times more than the average worker.
Right.
And in India, the combined wealth of the top 10 billionaires
Oh, wow.
could actually fund the country's entire public health care system.
That's incredible.
These disparities within nations
Yeah.
are like cracks in the foundation.
Like, that's a good way to put it.
They fuel political polarization,
Sure.
social unrest, even violence.
It's a cycle that's hard to break free from, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like a rigged game
Right.
where the wealthy have a built-in advantage and everyone else is struggling just to stay afloat. One of the most concerning aspects is how wealth disparities translate to unequal access to the essentials.
Right.
Think about education, legal representation, even just the right social networks.
Absolutely.
All of those things can either amplify your chances or hold you back.
It's true. Those born into affluent families often have access to top-tier education, legal resources, and networks that pave the way for success.
Yeah.
On the other hand, those lacking resources can find themselves trapped in a system that reinforces their disadvantages.
Right.
One of those compelling arguments in the research is this: framing inequality as just a problem for the poor
Okay.
is a mistake.
Interesting.
It's a problem that ultimately impacts all of us.
That's a perspective I hadn't fully considered before diving into this research. Why is that? What are the ripple effects of inequality that impact those who aren't necessarily struggling financially?
Well, for one, societies with high levels of inequality tend to have slower economic growth. It's counterintuitive, but the data is pretty clear on this.
Yeah.
When resources are concentrated in the hands of a few, it can actually stifle innovation and limit opportunities for collective progress. It's like we're all playing on a tilted playing field.
Right.
And even those who seem to be winning
Yeah.
ultimately lose out on the potential for a more prosperous future.
It's a fascinating paradox.
Yeah.
But what about the impact on things like health and democracy?
Okay.
I've heard those are affected by inequality as well.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure I fully understand how.
Let's start with health.
Okay.
Studies show that societies with high levels of inequality tend to have poorer overall health outcomes.
Ah.
This includes things like lower life expectancy, higher rates of chronic diseases, and even increased infant mortality rates.
Wow.
It's not just about access to health care either.
Right.
It's about the stress and social isolation that often accompany poverty, which can have a profound impact on both physical and mental health.
It's like a domino effect where one area of disadvantage leads to another, impacting the overall well-being of the entire society.
Right.
But how does inequality affect democracy?
Okay.
I would think that having a system where everyone has an equal vote would protect against that.
In theory, yes.
Okay.
But in practice,
Yeah.
when wealth becomes concentrated in the hands of a few, it can distort the political process. Think about campaign finance, for example.
Right.
Wealthy individuals and corporations can exert outsized influence on elections and policy decisions, often at the expense of the needs and interests of ordinary citizens.
It's like the age-old adage, power corrupts.
Yeah.
And when that power is concentrated in the hands of those with vast wealth, it can undermine the principles of fairness and representation
Exactly.
that are essential to a functioning democracy.
And one of the most urgent examples of this interplay between inequality and global challenges is climate change.
Right.
The data is striking. The world's richest 10% are responsible for over half of all greenhouse gas emissions,
Wow.
while the poorest 50% contribute a mere 10%.
That's a huge difference.
We're seeing the consequences of this imbalance play out in real time,
Yeah.
with those who contributed the least to the problem bearing the brunt of the impacts.
It's a harsh reality check.
It is.
But what I'm really curious about is this. We've painted a pretty stark picture of the problem.
Yeah.
But is there any hope for solutions? I mean, where do we even begin to tackle something as massive as global inequality? It feels almost paralyzing.
I understand that feeling.
Yeah?
It's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problem.
Right.
But remember, history is full of examples of seemingly insurmountable challenges being overcome.
Okay.
The sources you sent highlight a variety of approaches, from policy changes to technological innovations to grassroots movements, all offering pathways to a more equitable future.
Okay, so there's hope.
There is.
But let's get specific.
Yeah.
What are some of these potential game changers? Where do we start chipping away at this mountain of inequality?
One of the most frequently discussed solutions is wealth redistribution.
Okay.
This can take many forms, from progressive taxation, where the wealthy are taxed at a higher rate, to debt relief programs for developing nations.
Right.
There are examples of this working in places like Denmark,
Yeah.
where progressive taxation has helped create one of the most equitable societies in the world.
Denmark is always held up as a shining example of how to do things right.
Yeah.
But are there any examples from other parts of the world that demonstrate how even small changes can make a difference? It's hard to imagine how we could enact sweeping reforms on a global scale.
Absolutely. Consider this. A study by Oxfam found that a 2% wealth tax on billionaires globally could generate an astounding $2.5 trillion annually.
Wow.
That's enough to lift millions out of extreme poverty fund, universal health care, and even make significant investments in renewable energy infrastructure.
Wow, that's a powerful illustration of how even a seemingly modest shift in how wealth is distributed could have a dramatic impact.
It could.
But it's not just about taxing the wealthy, right?
Right.
What about the debt crisis that many developing nations are facing?
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty significant barrier to progress.
You're absolutely right. Imagine a country struggling to provide basic services to its citizens.
Yeah.
Because it's saddled with crippling debt repayments to wealthy nations and institutions.
Right.
There's a precedent for debt relief working in the early 2000s. Debt cancellation programs for heavily indebted countries wiped out billions of dollars in obligations, allowing them to redirect funds towards development.
It's like giving those nations the breathing room they need to invest in their own futures, rather than being trapped in a cycle of debt servitude.
Exactly.
It's a powerful example of how we can shift the balance of power within the global financial system.
It is.
And speaking of shifting the balance of power, let's talk about education.
Okay. We often hear that education is the key to breaking the cycle of poverty. But the research goes deeper than that.
It does.
It highlights the need to invest in quality education that empowers individuals to not just escape poverty, but also challenge the systems that perpetuate it.
So it's not just about giving people the tools to climb the existing ladder. It's about empowering them to build a new ladder altogether.
Precisely. Think about educational models that prioritize critical thinking, problem solving, and fostering a sense of social justice. Imagine a world where every child, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status, has access to an education that empowers them to question, to innovate, and to create change.
It's like we're not just equipping them with the knowledge and skills they need to succeed in the current system. We're empowering them to create a better system altogether.
But what about those who are already trapped in the cycle of poverty?
How do we address their immediate needs while also working towards long-term solutions?
That's a crucial question. And the sources offer some insights into that as well. One of the most compelling arguments is that we need to shift from a purely charitable approach to a more holistic model that emphasizes empowerment and agency.
So instead of just giving handouts, it's about partnering with communities and providing them with the resources and support they need to create their own solutions.
Exactly. Think about initiatives like microfinance, which provides small loans and financial services to entrepreneurs in developing countries, many of whom are women, or community-led development projects that empower local residents to identify their own needs and priorities and implement solutions tailored to their specific contexts.
It's about recognizing the inherent wisdom and resilience that exists within communities and providing them with the tools and the support they need to thrive. It's a shift from a top-down approach to a more collaborative and empowering model of development.
Precisely. And this same principle applies to addressing the climate crisis.
Okay.
It's not enough for wealthy nations to simply reduce their own carbon emissions.
Right.
They also have a responsibility to support developing countries in their efforts to adapt to the impacts of climate change and transition to more sustainable economies.
So it's about acknowledging the disproportionate burden that climate change places on those who contributed the least to the problem.
Yes.
And providing the financial and technological resources needed to create a more equitable and sustainable future for all.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that climate justice is inextricably linked to social justice.
Right.
And that we can't solve one without addressing the other.
But creating lasting change requires more than just policy reforms and financial investments.
It does.
It requires a fundamental shift in our values and attitudes.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about that shift.
Okay.
How do we move from a mindset of individualism and competition to one of empathy, compassion, and shared responsibility? It seems like such a monumental task.
It is a monumental task.
Yeah.
But I truly believe it's possible.
Okay.
One key is to start challenging the narratives that perpetuate inequality.
What do you mean by narratives?
Think about the stories we tell ourselves about success, about meritocracy, about the self-made individual.
Okay.
These stories often ignore the systemic factors that contribute to both success and failure, reinforcing the idea that inequality is simply a reflection of individual effort or talent.
So it's about acknowledging the role that privileged opportunity and even just plain luck play in shaping our lives.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our individual successes are built upon a foundation of collective effort and shared resources.
Right.
And it's about challenging the narratives that perpetuate stereotypes and prejudices that divide us based on race, gender, religion, or any other arbitrary category.
It's about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. Yes.
Regardless of their background, their beliefs, or their circumstances. And it's about creating a society that values compassion, empathy, and a sense of shared responsibility for the well-being of all.
Precisely. And this requires us to engage in open and honest conversations about the ways in which our systems and our institutions perpetuate inequality. To listen to and learn from those who have different lived experiences from our own. And to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
It's about creating spaces for dialogue, empathy, and understanding where we can deconstruct the power dynamics that perpetuate inequality, challenge the narratives that justify discrimination, and work together to build a more inclusive and equitable society.
It's a tall order, but it's a necessary one if we want to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. And it all starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own thoughts, words, and actions.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in dismantling systems of oppression and building a more just and equitable world.
And it starts with the choices we make every day.
Absolutely.
The conversations we have, the stories we tell, and the actions we take.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our individual well-being is tied to the well-being of others. And that we have a collective responsibility to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
And it's about remembering that change is possible.
It is.
Throughout history, social movements have challenged injustice-shifted paradigms and created a more equitable and just world.
That's right.
Think about the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, and countless other struggles for equality. These movements demonstrate that ordinary people working together can achieve extraordinary things.
And the fight against inequality is no different. It requires us to stand up for what we believe in, to challenge the status quo. And to work together to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
It's a call to action, a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent. The stakes are too high.
They are.
The future of humanity hangs in the balance.
And it all starts with each of us taking responsibility, making conscious choices, and using our voices and our actions to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world.
That's a powerful message of hope and empowerment.
It is.
It's a reminder that change is within our reach.
Yeah.
But it requires us to act, to engage, and to never give up on the fight for a better future.
And it starts with each of us asking ourselves, what can I do to make a difference?
Right.
It's about recognizing that even small actions, when multiplied by millions, can create a ripple effect that transforms the world.
So let's embrace that challenge.
Let's
Let's be the change we wish to see in the world.
Absolutely.
Let's create a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Yeah.
A future where justice and equality prevail.
That's a vision worth striving for, a future worth fighting for.
Yeah.
And together, we can make it a reality.
It's like holding up a mirror to ourselves and our society, isn't it?
Yeah.
Challenging those ingrained narratives that we often take for granted.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that we all have biases, whether conscious or unconscious,
Right.
and that we have a responsibility to confront those biases and to work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate them.
It feels like this deep dive has really shifted my perspective on how deeply ingrained inequality is in so many aspects of our lives.
One thing that really struck me in the research
Yeah.
was the exploration of alternative economic models,
Okay.
challenging that assumption that capitalism as it currently exists
Right.
is the only viable system.
I'm really interested in that.
Yeah.
What are some of the alternative models that are being explored? I've heard whispers of things like degrowth and universal basic income, but I haven't really dug into what those actually mean.
There's a fascinating array of ideas out there.
Yeah.
Degrowth, for example, challenges the idea that endless economic growth is sustainable or even desirable. It proposes a shift towards a more localized, ecologically balanced, and socially just economy that prioritizes well-being over material consumption.
It's like questioning the fundamental assumption that more is always better, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have concepts like universal basic income, or UBI, which is gaining traction in various parts of the world.
Okay.
This involves providing every citizen with a guaranteed basic income, regardless of their employment status.
I can see how that could be a game changer for people struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it disincentivize people from working? I have to admit I'm a little skeptical about how that would actually play out in practice.
That's a common concern.
Yeah.
And it's one that researchers are actively studying.
Okay.
Early results from pilot programs in places like Finland and Kenya suggest that UBI doesn't necessarily lead to a decrease in workforce participation.
That's interesting. Are there any other promising economic models that are being explored?
Another area that's generating a lot of buzz is the cooperative movement.
Okay.
Cooperatives are businesses that are owned and controlled by their members,
Yeah.
whether they're workers, consumers, or producers.
Okay.
This model promotes democratic decision-making, shared ownership, and a focus on social responsibility.
It's like taking the power back from large corporations, putting it into the hands of the people who are actually doing the work.
That's the idea.
What are your thoughts on the potential of worker-owned cooperatives to create a more just and equitable economy?
I think they have immense potential.
Okay.
They offer a way to reimagine the relationship between labor and capital,
Yeah.
to create businesses that prioritize the well-being of their workers and their communities, rather than solely maximizing profits for shareholders.
It's like a paradigm shift, isn't it? Moving away from this extractive model of capitalism to something that's more collaborative and community-oriented.
Exactly. And it's not just about economic models.
Right.
There's also a growing movement to rethink our relationship with nature, to move away from this anthropocentric worldview that sees humans as separate from and superior to the natural world.
That resonates with me.
Yeah.
I've been reading a lot about indigenous knowledge systems and how they offer a different way of relating to the earth.
Right.
One that's based on reciprocity, respect, and interconnectedness.
It's a perspective that's urgently needed, wouldn't you say?
I think so.
We're facing a climate crisis that's inextricably linked to our extractive relationship with nature.
Right.
Indigenous knowledge systems offer valuable insights into how we can live in harmony with the planet.
Right.
How we can create a more sustainable and just future for all.
I feel like this conversation has really opened my eyes to the interconnectedness of all these issues, how inequality, environmental degradation, and social injustice are all intertwined.
They are, and that's why it's so important to approach these challenges from a holistic perspective, to recognize that we can't solve one without addressing the others.
Yeah. It's like we're all threads in this intricate tapestry.
Yeah.
And when one thread is pulled, the whole fabric is affected.
That's a beautiful analogy.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that our actions have ripple effects.
Right.
That we have a responsibility to consider the consequences of our choices, not just for ourselves, but for the well-being of the planet and for future generations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into global inequality, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
If there's one thing I hope you take from this exploration, it's that global inequality is a complex issue, but it's not insurmountable.
Right.
We have the knowledge, the tools, and the resources to create a more just and equitable world.
Yeah.
What we need now is the collective will.
Right.
The courage to challenge the status quo and the commitment to work together to build a better future for all.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play.
Absolutely.
That our choices matter.
They do.
And that together we can create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep pushing for change.
Yes.
Because in the end, we all rise together.